Welcome to IDT Talks. My name is Anastasia Lavrina, and today we have a very special guest. Andrew Harper is the Special Advisor on Climate Action for the United Nations Refugees Agency. Warm welcome to Ada University. Thank you so much. I have some questions related to your background, to what you are doing today. So let me start with the simplest one. Could you provide specific examples of how climate change has led to an increase in displacement, particularly among vulnerable populations?
Well, what we're finding is that the recent increase in refugees worldwide have often been coming from countries that are also being impacted by climate change. And so what does that mean? It means that countries that are already fragile are being forced over into becoming almost failed states. So in West Africa, for instance, or in the Eastern Horn of Africa, we're also seeing that climate change is impacting on food security. And if populations are hungry, if they're starving, then there's also more likelihood for conflict. And so populations that have been displaced by conflict are then doubly being impacted by climate change. So you have refugees who have crossed into neighbouring countries, and because of the lack of funds, they're being forced to live in a tent. They often can only afford one meal per day. The children are not getting access to schools or healthcare. And on top of that, you have these increase in temperatures, or you have these floods coming through. So it's just making life for the most vulnerable even more vulnerable. And so unfortunately what we're seeing is that 70% of the world's refugees are coming from these countries who don't have the capacity, or who are often lacking the capacity.
70%.
70%. So you have that very close correlation between countries that are in conflict and those countries which are also suffering due to climate change.
Wow. So what role does international cooperation play in addressing climate-induced displacement, and how can collaborations between stakeholders be strengthened to ensure effective coordination? We can do a lot, but together we can do even more.
Yeah, well, collaboration is what it's all about. Just like climate change doesn't respect international borders, when you want to address climate change, you need a whole of society approach. You need every country involved. And so UNHCR works with governments, works with international regional institutions, but increasingly is working with banks and climate funds, because we need heavy investment in order to support adaptation and resilience. We need to understand what governments are prioritising in terms of adaptation and resilience, but we also need to make sure that if money is given to communities, it reaches those most in need, because money is nothing unless it makes an impact.
You touched a very important issue: financial sources, money. And I guess this will be one of the key questions which will be raised during COP29 conference, which will take place in Azerbaijan in less than 2 months. So what will be UNHCR message for world leaders and negotiators during this conference?
Well, the simple message is we're not doing enough, and we're not addressing the needs of those people who are most vulnerable first. Like there's a lot of statements being made in New York and elsewhere saying we can't neglect those people who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, but we are. The money is not sufficient. Like there's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of discussions, but there's very few decisions. Very little progress, unfortunately, has been made since COP last year, the decision to create a loss and damage fund. There's a lot of announcements in terms of money being promised. That money is not getting to the field.
Right.
And so if you're a woman with children and you're living in a tent with no shade, no water, you don't really care about the niceties or the definitions. You just want that support. So what we'd be saying is, look, at COP29, we have had very good discussions with the COP presidency so far. Bring people first. Bring the sense of urgency and the needs of women, children, the elderly to these discussions. Don't just get stuck in a UN bureaucratic process, because people can't afford that.
People first, and we have to work together to help them to move forward and deal with all of those issues. So what role do you see the conference of the parties, COP, playing in addressing the issues on climate-induced displacement concretely? Yeah,
well, it's super important. Again, I had a very good discussion with the COP29 presidency designate, and who understood, because as Azerbaijan understands conflict, understands displacement, and the needs of people being present, but not only being present, but being in the decisions. Like there's a saying which says, no decision about us without us. And I think one of the key elements that we've achieved over the last few years has been the greater inclusion and recognition that displaced people due to conflict are particularly vulnerable. There's probably no one who's more vulnerable. And we need that funding to get to those countries who are providing that protection. The countries like Jordan or Uganda or Kenya or Bangladesh, those countries who have been doing the right thing, who've been contributing a global good, are now being impacted, and I dare say their generosity is being compromised by the impacts of climate change. We need to value peace. We need to invest in peace. And if climate change is threatening that, we need to double down.
Right. And my last question, how can we ensure that commitments made at COP29 are translated into tangible actions for affected populations?
Well, I think that's an absolutely critical issue, because if money is being provided to a government, it's no use that the money gets to a capital and stays there. It needs to be translated into better education, healthcare, climate smart agriculture. We need to make sure money gets to the women who are farming in increasingly perilous conditions. So this is the need for transparency. We need to know where the money goes, how is it accounted for. There's something called monitoring and evaluation. We need that to be very robust. We can't afford for money to go missing when there's so little of it about, and when the needs are so great.
Then we should have a special mechanism on how to control this process.
Yeah, well, the issue is, it's a matter of making sure that governments understand that funding is not sort of ongoing. It's not a tap. Well, I suppose it is a tap, because if money goes missing or is not accountable for, then the tap will be turned off. So it's an issue of trust. It's an issue of accountability. It's like if you gave money to somebody, you want to make sure it gets to the people on the ground who need it. It's the same with UNHCR. If somebody contributes money to UNHCR, we have to demonstrate that impact. So it's about impact. The commitments are important, but if there's no impact, it means very little.
So we can conclude our conversation with a statement like the conference COP29 is a very important event which will take place in Baku in Azerbaijan, where the countries can finally come to the conclusion to come up with any kind of model which will help to deal with all of those issues we used to talk about today. And Azerbaijan has a unique opportunity.
Do you want me to say that?
I'm just sharing my impressions, and I want you to add something.
Okay, well, it's absolutely true. Like there's been 28 COPs previous to this one. They've achieved very little in many aspects in terms of that impact.
Unfortunately.
What we need now is COP29 with Azerbaijan as the president, to be taking that mantle on behalf of those people who are most vulnerable, to unlock the financing, bring those countries who have made commitments, raise the ambition, raise the vision, but also raise the urgency that we can't wait for another COP in order to get money out the door in terms of loss and damage. We need to raise the new commitments. Right. $100 billion is not sufficient when the needs are in the trillions. And most importantly, we need to bring the world together. We need to bring the world together in terms of those people who are benefiting from fossil fuels. They need to contribute to protecting those people who are suffering from the use of those fossil fuels.
Great. Thank you so much. It was a great honor to talk with you.
It was a pleasure.